All right, we'll be in 2 Kings and 25 this morning. We're going to be talking about Zedekiah. And some of the objectives here in this lesson that they're wanting to point out, you guys see these in your books as well, but to see that it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And I don't think it's telling us we just have to be scared to death of God, but I think it's telling us that when we get out of the will of God, we need to take that serious and know that there could be something coming for us that's not very good, right? So we need to be fearful in the fact that we need to always try to strive what God has us to do and have that fearful respect for Him. To be moved to the repentance by God's judgment of the unrepentant. And also to put our trust in the Lord. And I think that's something that, we've been taught many times in the Bible and many sermons we've heard. We always need to put that trust in God. And I know it's repeated and repeated in the Bible, so it must be something that's kind of hard for us to do, right? Anytime you see story after story that kind of come out to the same way and in the same type of a lesson, it's something that God's trying to get across to us. And I thought the title of this lesson was fairly intriguing as well. God's the instrument of judgment. There's plenty of instruments of judgment that the Lord will use, and we see here, if you study this lesson, that it was a pretty bad instrument, or the way that things played out for these folks wasn't in their favor at all. But we've seen that in other lessons that we've had here recently, and how God's had to bring Israel down to their knees and get their attention again, and that's exactly what He's doing here. But that can happen to us as well. So whatever the instrument of judgment God's using, it's a learning lesson for us, and it may be something hard, but it's something we'll get through with Him. But at the same time, I think we can kind of deter these things off and not get into that point as well if we try to obey God as much as we possibly can. But we see in these stories, these folks, they got off onto some paths and stayed there for a while, and with idolatries and things that they were doing. So we'll go ahead and try to read a couple verses here. Then there's a lot of information in this. As usual, I probably won't get to most of it, but in verse 25, it kind of sets the stage for us a little bit here. We'll read up through maybe verse 4 and talk about that a little bit. Maybe up through verse 3, maybe 4 right there, probably 3, then we'll talk about that just a little bit, and then we'll go forward some. But it says in verse 1 in 25, it came to pass in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month and the 10th day of the month, that Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon came, he and all his host, against Jerusalem, and pitched against it. And they built forts against it round about. And the city was besieged unto the 11th year of King Zedekiah. And on the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine prevailed in the city, and there was no bread for the people of the land. So we'll set the stage a little bit here. After Hezekiah, his son Manasseh took over in Judah. And Hezekiah was a good king, as we learned before, but Manasseh was another one of the evil kings. He came in, he set up idolatry, he set up the pagan type worships, he took him down another bad road. I think he reigned for around 55 years or something like that, and then his son Amon took over. So once Amon took over, I think his reign lasted about 2 years, and his son Josiah became king, who was around 8 years old, I believe, at that time, King Josiah, and he turned out to be a very good king. It tells us in some of the commentaries, arguably maybe one of the best that Judah had. And we saw that Hezekiah was a pretty good king, and we see that Josiah has came in, and he has, I don't want to use the word resurrected, but he has changed things in the land. He's got rid of the idolatries. He's got rid of all the pagan worships. He's reformed the temple. He's reformed the religious ways of doing things and the worship. So he's brought a good time here to Israel, or to Judah down here, and trying to do things in the right way that the Lord would have him to do. But at some point, he decided, Assyria and Egypt were foes with each other. Assyria was a pretty strong nation at this point in time, but they were starting to show a little bit of weakness. And Egypt was, thinking about, okay, they're rising up here, maybe showing a little more of their dominance, because Assyria is showing a little bit of weakness. So Josiah decided that he would, try to go to battle against Egypt to kind of show favor, or get the favor of the Assyrians on his side. Well, he died in battle. He got killed in battle. So after he died, you had 3 of his sons that eventually would take reign. Joachim was the first one. I think he didn't last but a few months or a couple years, something like that, without trying to pull it up through the notes here. And then you had, I apologize, but you had his next son take over for, I think, about 11 years as well. and he was king for 11 years. And then, let me find my notes here. I do apologize for the pause here. You write all these things down, and then you go try to find them all, and you think, why did I put that there? It'd help if I'd get on the right page as well. Well, anyway, we'll get those names out here for you in just a second. But as Josiah died, like I said, his son Joachim took over, and he was there for just a little bit of time. And then he had another son that took over as well. And then he was there for about 11 years, and then his son, which would have been Josiah's grandson, was king, and his name was Joachim, and he was king for a period of time there. But when King Nebuchadnezzar came into the land just a little before the period we were reading about there, they took him into captive, and they took him into Babylon and put him into prison. So that's when Zedekiah came into the picture right there. His name actually was Matana or something like that. I'm digging through my notes here, I didn't mark them properly. But his name was different. It was Matahai or something like that. And King Nebuchadnezzar changed his name to Zedekiah. Now, Zedekiah was the youngest son of Josiah, I'm sorry. And I might have been saying Joash the whole time, but it's Josiah. But he was the youngest son of Josiah. But he actually wasn't the king at this point in time. Joachim was, which was Josiah's grandson, which would have been this man's uncle. So he named him king. He took the king, put him in prison, and he selected this man, Nebuchadnezzar did, for the king of Judah. And he named him Zedekiah. So he told Zedekiah, he made him promise him that he wouldn't try to rise up against him. He wouldn't try to go against Babylon. And Zedekiah said, okay, I'll do that. But immediately Zedekiah started trying to come up with plans, ways of overthrowing the kingdom, ways of, freeing himself. And it tells us back in Jeremiah. Jeremiah prophesied that, what they should do is just let Babylonian rule. And we'll get to that here in just a second, maybe pull up those verses. I didn't give them to Kathy, but we may go ahead and read those. But it was prophesied by Jeremiah that Babylon would take over Israel or take over Judah. And the best thing for them to do is what Zedekiah was told, was just to go along with it. And God will take care of it. He's using them for an instrument for his punishment to Judah at this point in time. And that, do not try to rebel against them, and your life will be saved, and the city won't be burned. So he prophesies to them, if you rebel against Babylon, eventually it will cost you your life, and this city will be burned down and destroyed. But Zedekiah, he didn't really want to adhere to that. He didn't like hearing that. It's no different than Ahab back when we learned about, him seeking counsel when they were going to go into war, and he didn't like what the prophet told him. So they went ahead and went, and it cost him his life. So here he's being warned by a prophet of God, do not do this. This is not what God wants. He's using this for, basically to teach you guys a lesson. So we get up to that point, and he rebelled against him. I think Nebuchadnezzar knew what was kind of going on. He had probably gotten word that this guy was talking to some other kings and things. So he even went into Babylon and talked to Nebuchadnezzar and tried to assure him of this. But in that same year, about the 4th year of his reign, he went back in and met up with kings from Edom and from the Ammonites and some of these other kings, Tyre and some other folks in the region, and tried to get a coalition together to overthrow Babylon. Well, and sometime later here, about the 9th year of his reign, is when Nebuchadnezzar brought the troops in, and they surrounded the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem at that time was probably a double-walled city. It was very fortified, but they just camped out around it. And they stayed there for about a year and a half. And so camping out around it, basically what they did, they shut down any commerce, any trade that was coming to and forth from this city. They wasn't letting stuff come in. They weren't letting things come out. So now the famine is starting to set in. After being here for about a year and a half, the people are starting to get hungry. There's no bread for the folks, it tells us here in the scripture. And I'm sure they're just sitting here thinking, wow, what can we do about this, right? And Jeremiah's already told Zedekiah, you shouldn't rebel against them, you should let them have their way. And that goes against all human nature, right? We're going to try to do something to save ourselves if we can. But and we see, and it gets to it very quickly right here in verse 20, or in chapter 25, and we'll look at verses 4 through 7 or 8 there in just a second. But as they sat out there camped around, Zedekiah is still trying to figure out ways of getting out, doing things, but the people are starving. they've shut them down. And that was a tactic that was used in those days. I mean, if they come in and besiege your city and round about and camp around it and shut off all your gates, I mean, what are you going to do, right? You're not going to be able to mount up against them. They've got you pretty much pinned down, and that was their strategic part of their war right there. It was very psychological, and it was very physical, because these people are starving to death at this point. So now we see it at a point right here that Zedekiah and his army, they decide that, we're going to flee out of here. They came up with a plan. In the middle of the night there, and we'll read this at verse 4 right here. And the city was broken up, and all the men of war fled by night by the way of the gate between the two walls, which is by the king's garden. Now the Chaldees, which are the Babylonians, were against the city round about, and the king went toward the plain. And the army of the Chaldees pursued after the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho, and all his army were scattered from him. So they took the king and brought him up to the king of Babylon, to Riblah, and they gave judgment upon him. And they slew his sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, and put out the eyes of Zedekiah, and bound him with fetters of brass, and carried him to Babylon. So we see here that they devised a plan. They got their plan together. They snuck out between the two walls into a gate. I think it was around the garden of the king. And they left in the middle of the night. And when they did this, the army came out with the king, but they all just kind of dispersed. They went off into their own different ways. So there wasn't a congregated unit right here for protection of each other. There wasn't, they weren't all gathered together is what I'm trying to say, to where they could even fight back when they are caught or when they pursue after them. So they just kind of go out and they spread out. And Zedekiah, he makes it all the way to the plains of Jericho, which if you look at that, it's around 18 miles from Jerusalem. So, Zedekiah's probably thinking at this point in time, this was successful. I mean, he's made it 18 miles away on foot. That's a good distance. It's up on past Johnson City, getting towards Elizabeth and from here probably. So he's probably thinking, hey, this was successful. We got out of there. We're safe. But they were overtaken by the Babylonians. They saw them coming out of there. They're round about the city. They've encamped around the place. They realized that someone had escaped here. So when they caught up to Zedekiah right there in Jericho, that's when they captured him. They took him back to Riblah, where King Nebuchadnezzar was at the time. And then it tells us here that they killed his sons right in front of him. And that was customary back then, to kill a king's sons when you're overtaking something, because you don't want any rebellion later. You don't want the men of the family to be able to rise up and take that revenge upon you. So he killed his sons. But then it tells us they blinded him right there, poked his eyes out. However they did it, they took his eyes out. Now this man, he's just disobeyed what a prophet of God has told him to do. Okay, he told him it was going to be his inevitable death. Now he's watched his children die, and now he's been blinded. So what's the last thing he's seen? For the rest of his life, probably that's what flashed in his mind, was those children getting murdered right in front of him. Because that's the last thing he saw. And they put him in shackles, they put him in fetters, and they took him into Babylon, where he lived out the rest of his days and died. So it doesn't tell us a lot more about him then, and we don't know his inner thoughts, but wow, what regrets he had. Did he talk to the Lord during that period? We don't know. But he saw his children die in front of him, the last thing that the man saw. And I thought, man, that is just unbelievable to think of that, right? You'd want to be killed right then yourself. But he gave him time to think about it. No different, I think, when we hear about folks going into hell. We heard about the rich man wanting, that wouldn't give Lazarus any bread, or, the beggar Lazarus there. And the rich man wanted him to talk to his family. And it was such a horrible place to be. And I think I've heard, preachers say as well, you've got physical pain in hell, but also the mental anguish. Are these folks going to be down there hearing sermons that they've heard in the past? Are they going to be hearing people that's testified to them? Our minds can be a very detriment to us sometimes. Folks that, maybe suffer with a little bit of anxiety, depression, and things like that. Our mind can be a very positive thing for us, or it can really drag us down if we let the devil get in there and we let things just kind of be real negative and no hope inside, if you will, and things like that. So you can imagine what's going through this man's mind after all this. He was warned by a true prophet of God. But before this, that we're kind of overlooking here, I got started off kind of fast, and George tells me to slow down all the time. I'm trying, George, I promise. I got all this information I'm trying to spit out here. But anyway, before this, he had a lot of false teachers and a lot of false prophets around him as well. A lot of advisors that was just telling him, same as they told Ahab and some of these other folks, go do what you want to do. God will be with you. God will be with you. And we have got to be careful with what we're listening to. we've got to be careful. We have to pray for discernment. And it brought me to thoughts of this world today. When you have these wolves in sheep's clothing out here, and when you have these people, I think as Christians sometimes we get too caught up in somebody that mentioned Jesus. Somebody mentioned Jesus or somebody mentioned God, and we want to label them a Christian when we don't know if they are or not. We don't know their fruits. We've not seen how their actions are. We're not around these people. But then you may see a political figure talk about God, but then you may see him on TV again throwing around some cuss words, right? Words that we would dare not use as Christians. So let's be careful in this world today. And I think we're excited to hear somebody talk about Jesus or mention his name. Because, man, we want more people converted. We want more people like us. It's a pleasure for me when I go out to a job and find out the person I'm working for is a Christian. Then we've got this brotherhood. We've got this, or if it's a lady, you've just got this kindred spirit with these people, and you can talk about the Lord with them, and sometimes I end up talking with them about the Lord more than I get, longer than it took me to do the job sometimes. You're trying to get to the next one maybe or something, but it's an awesome thing to be around other children of the Lord. But I think sometimes we brand folks of that before we really know, just because they mention God. Because you think, if they mention Jesus, they have to be a Christian. So let's just be careful on who and what we're listening to and practice discernment, especially today, because the devil's running rampant. He wants to confuse, he wants to destroy, he wants to get to us in any manner that he can. And if those are avenues that he can open up, then he'll do that. So that just kind of brought those things to my mind. You see some of these folks, we listen to a lot of contemporary Christian music because the children get into it. And I know some folks think, well, we shouldn't listen to that and this and that and the other. And I think you've got to be careful. I have figured out you can't just, that's like I told my kids, like the songs, but don't put any faith in these singers, because you're going to wake up one day and you're going to get your heart broke. And you see sometimes how some of these that are out here winning the awards and making a ton of money, some of the people they're running with, and some of the places they're going to sing their songs, and some of those that they're entertaining. There was an award show on not too long ago, and one of the fellows that was there, I think he owns an alcoholic establishment in Nashville. He still sings, terrible music. He does terrible things on stage, but they had him up there and he was almost preaching. And I thought, no, what are we doing here? We're turning this into entertainment. We're turning this into something that God is not going to smile upon. If you're going to win an award for singing something, that's one thing. But when you're just trying to entertain people for the sake of entertaining them, whether it's Christian music or whatever, that's what the secular stuff's for, right? There's no meaning to that. It's mostly trash, if you want to get my opinion of it, which sometimes my opinion is not very popular. But most of this secular music is trash, period. And I'm not saying that all these singers, whether it was somebody that wrote a hymn or somebody who's singing contemporary music today, are godly saints. It works both ways, but you have to practice discernment and know that, hey, the song may have some meaning to you, but don't fall in love with that artist. They will break your heart. We've seen that recently in the news with some of them, and then it does happen. But getting back to what we're trying to talk about here, Zedekiah was not obedient at all to what he heard from Jeremiah, and it cost him his life. It caused him to see gruesome thing there when he saw what happened with his children. And you can go all the way back into Ezekiel. I thought I would read this one in Ezekiel chapter 12, if you want to turn there. I didn't give this to Kathy, so we'll read it to you. In chapter 12, starting at about verse 12, I think it's just always amazing, how God ties things together and how you can, they say the Bible, all these naysayers, is just a myth, right? It's a storybook. Well, I'd like to meet the author who could write a storybook like this, that can tie things from the front to the back to the middle and all that. I mean, how brilliant would you have to be to write a book like this that coincided with each other in different chapters, different verses, and all just came back together? I mean, this is inspired by God, and we know that. So in chapter 12 of Ezekiel, in verse 12, it said, "And the prince that is among them shall bear his shoulder on the twilight, and shall go forth and shall dig through the wall to carry out thereby. He shall cover his face, that he should not see the ground with his eyes. My net also will I spread upon him, and he shall be taken in my snare. And I will bring him to Babylon, to the land of the Chaldeans. Yet shall he not see it, though he shall die there. And I shall scatter toward every wind all that are about him to help him and all his bands, and I will draw out the sword after them. And they shall know that I am the Lord, when I shall scatter them among the nations and disperse them in the countries. But I will leave a few men of them from the sword, from the famine, and from the pestilence, that they may declare all their abominations among the heathen, whither they come, and whether they shall know I am the Lord. So this is a prophecy right here in Ezekiel that's talking about Zedekiah. He's telling us right here in these verses leading up, they're going to dig out of the walls. He's going to cover his face. Some believe it was out of shame, because here is the king running out here with his head down trying to sneak out. Some believe he's trying to disguise himself, right? But this was prophesied even right here in Ezekiel, and it tells us right here, he will, what was it in 13? My net shall also spread upon him. He will be overtaken. He shall be taken in my snare. They will trap him and bring him in. They'll bring him to Babylon, to the land of the Chaldeans, yet he shall not see it. He was going to be blind when he got there, right? He's saying he'll never see the town or city of Babylon when he's brought in at this point in time, because he was going to be blinded. So I thought this was, something that you can always run these things down and find something amazing in the Word of God. But here it is being prophesied. Jeremiah told them about it. And it even brought up, Matthew 13 and 9, when we talk about discernment and listening and hearing. Those who have ears, let him hear. Simple verse. Zedekiah had ears, but he didn't hear. He didn't listen. It wasn't what he wanted to be told. And sometimes I think we're like that. We may have a plan in life. We may, I think one of the commentators brought it up, and it might have even been in the quarterly over here. Do we want to walk with God, or do we want God walking with us? Do we want to have God with us when we need him, or do we want to have God with us at all times? Do we say, God, I'm doing this, bless it, or do we say, God, am I supposed to do this, let me know? And we know it'll be blessed, right? So this is not what, happened here. And it tells us that some were left. And before I lose the thought in my mind too, I thought another interesting point that you can kind of pull out of this. When we talked about Ahab, and we talked about how his family was going to be cursed, we know that he went into Naboth's land, or Naboth land, and he took it. And they murdered him, and they took his vineyards, and he took it in a cruel way because he didn't want to sell it to him. And we learned then in that lesson that we taught that his son was murdered in that same land. He murdered a man there. Now his son got murdered there. But we see here, I thought was interesting, where did Zedekiah make it to? He made it to Jericho. Okay, they're going to tell us, and I'm going to pull out a little bit of a twist here and not go against anything in the Bible, obviously, here in a minute, but they tell us that Zedekiah was the last king of Judah. Okay, he was the last appointed king, but he was appointed of Nebuchadnezzar. But he was the last king of Judah. Before that kingdom was broken up, scattered about, and then you had the different rules. You had the Persians after that come in for so many years, from like 538 BC maybe down to 333. Then you had the Hellenistic period come in. You had Alexander the Great, the Greeks working through Egypt and things. You had them for a number of years, all the way until the Roman Empire took over, which was there when Jesus was born and when he was crucified. So after this, there was no other king of Judah. Israel had already been overtaken 130 or so years before this. They had been scattered out, never came back to the land. You learned that those are called the lost tribes. So God has scattered his people out. But what I was getting at with Jericho, what else happened in Jericho? Where did Joshua go in at? They went in and tore down the walls of Jericho by marching around them. That's where they stepped foot into the promised land. That was the beginning. And the last king of Judah got captured in Jericho and taken away. So I just think the way the Lord does things is amazing. May not have any significance to anybody else, but I thought, man, that's pretty cool when you think this is where it started. This is where he sent Joshua in. They marched around that place for 7 days. They yelled real loud, and the walls fell out. I started to say the walls fell in, but science is showing how science starts to, science has proven the Bible, like I told you guys a few weeks ago or last week, a lot. If you're under siege, most of the time that army out there, if they tear your walls down, they're going to push them in. They're not going to pull them out on themselves, right? They're not going to take a chance on pulling a wall out and killing themselves. They're trying to push it in and come in on you. These walls have been shown during archaeological digs and things that they fell out. So that proves the point, or proves the story of Joshua marching around and the walls fell out. So, but what I'm getting at, the first place where this started and the Israelites were able to go in and establish the land that God had for them is the last place that one of their kings was captured and taken out. Before this was all. And it tells us right here in Ezekiel, he scattered them out. After that, the people were all scattered, but it does say that there was a few left over. So basically what happened here, after he was killed, a little bit of time went by, and Nebuchadnezzar and his people, they came in, they looted the temple, They tore the place to pieces. They took all of the things that were of any kind of worth out of the temple. They took them with them back to their land, and they carried the people off. But also what did they do? They burned the city, and they tore the walls down. And that's exactly what Jeremiah told Zedekiah that was going to happen. If you let God have his way here, if you let him use this instrument of punishment against you guys, and you don't fight back against the Babylonians, and you don't come up with your own plan, you won't die, and the city won't be burned. But he's already been killed, and now the city is being burned down. The temple of God's being burnt down. The house of the king, all the other houses in the land. And there was no army and no king there to defend that. And that's what, and that brought another thought to my mind. How defenseless are we without King Jesus in our life? How defenseless are we without our King, living right here in our heart through the Holy Spirit? These people had no defenses whatsoever. Their so-called king, which they didn't even like him anyway because he was appointed by Nebuchadnezzar. He wasn't really their king. He didn't show a whole lot of backbone there, did he? Because he wanted to run off himself with his army, and they all dispersed out. So there was no way for any kind of defense once he was caught, and they caught up to those guys and killed him as well. But Nebuchadnezzar comes in, they loot the temple, I'm sure they looted the other houses, they looted the king's house, I'm sure they took anything of worth, and if it was too big to carry out there, they broke it down and took it out. They destroyed it and took it out in pieces. Then they burnt the place down. And then they took any of the rest of it, they carried off the majority of the city. And the ones that they did carry off that had any kind of a higher ranking, whether they were city officials, higher up, maybe in the military that were still there or anything, they killed them. They took them out. They're not going to have any opposition from these folks. But they did leave a few people. They left the poorest of the country, those who had no properties, those who were not a threat to them, right? They left those there to work the vineyards, to be the husbandman, which, as I know, surely most of y'all know, is someone who's a farmer, a tiller of the ground. They left people to work the lands, and they left people to tend to the grapes. And they sent wine over to Babylon. So they left them there to work for them. And I never want to get political up here talking things like this, but reminding me, what kind of path is America on, right? Are we any different than these people right here? We see what goes on in this country of ours today, the defiance to law enforcement, the things that are going on, the ideology that, God created me different than I should be. Anything that can go against God, the devil is harboring up there. And I remember not all that long ago, in some of these administrations, the middle class of this country was kind of squashed. You had some folks that were wealthy, and you had some folks that were kind of living down here trying to survive, and a lot of the factories and a lot of things were taken out and sent to other countries and things like that. And those folks in the middle that were making okay money, that could have a voice amongst each other, that could come together and maybe oppose some of these things, were kind of wiped away. And that's what's going on here. They took people out, they murdered the ones that could be opposition to them, and they left those that were no threat. They left them to work for them. I don't want to call them slaves, whatever, but they left them to work for them. They left them to do their duties. And these folks, this is what they did. Now they appointed, I can never think of his name or say his name without looking at it. They appointed a governor down there to kind of look over these people. His name was Gedaliah. He was made a governor over those that were left in Jerusalem to look over them. And he was a fairly decent man. He was generous. He was kind of, I don't want to say soft, but he wasn't rebellious. And he was a man who kind of figured out, hey, we just need to go along with what Babylon's doing here for our own safety. There were some in the group, a man named Ishmael, obviously not the one that Abraham had, but another Ishmael, that they didn't like that. So after just a few, maybe short months, I had to go back in here and see where I wrote it down. I need to start doing a better job with that. But they killed him. So they took him out because they didn't like the fact that he wasn't willing to rebel against Babylon. And so they killed him, but then those that killed him, what did they do? They ran off to Egypt and hid. And they lived out their days and were killed there, or died there. So, it didn't really make any sense for them to kill this man, because their purpose wasn't, there was nothing good came out of it. They had to flee out of fear, and went off into Egypt. And we see that, everything here is went against what God was wanting the folks to do. And it turned out very bad for them. And before I forget again here, I get all these things going through my mind, I want to say, when you saw that right there in Ezekiel, they didn't refer to Zedekiah as a king. They referred to him as a prince. Ezekiel never referred to him as a king. He referred to him as a prince. And when you really get to thinking about it, Zedekiah was the last king of Judah, but he was appointed by Nebuchadnezzar. Joachim was through the Davidic family, and so was Zedekiah, but he was the true king at this point in time. He was imprisoned. So this man was just set in his place when the true king was still alive and was imprisoned. So who was really the last king, right? Zedekiah is getting the credit for being the last king, and he made that fatal mistake, and it tore down all of it. But we find that if you kept looking through your Bible there, if you kept reading on out into it a little bit, we see that Joachim was eventually released out of prison by Nebuchadnezzar's oldest son, and in the Bible they call him Evil Merodach. I thought that's a pretty wild name, and it was exactly that, I'm sure, if he was anything like his father, which he was. But he had been imprisoned as well earlier in his life, and he was in prison with Jehoiachin, and kind of got to know him a little bit and heard his story. So he let him out. Once he became king, once Nebuchadnezzar, passed away or whatever, he became king, and he let him out of prison and kind of kept him in Babylon and treated him fairly well. So we see how these things take these twists and turns. He was in prison for, I think, 37 years before he was released by this man. And then the Bible tells us there that he stayed over there, and they treated him well and whatnot. And I didn't really try to study into as much of that on that side. But that's where it got me thinking about the timeline, as far as the kings and things. And then you had the Persian rule, and that's when you had Zerubbabel, and you had Ezra, and you had Nehemiah came on the scene in these days. And then, for a period of time, you had Alexander the Great, and then some Egyptians trying to rule things there. And then the Romans came in and defeated them, I guess, and took some things over. So there never was another king in Judah or Israel until Jesus showed up, right? And of course, a lot of them didn't want to accept him as the king because he didn't come in with war in his mind, and he didn't come in trying to kill everybody and avenge everybody. He came in different. He came in wanting to save the sick. He came in wanting to spread something different. So there's still, I think, folks in that region today who don't, accept Jesus for the king. But that was the next true king out of David's lineage, and that's the one that we know and love today, right? And we know he's our king, and we know that he brought us salvation. We know he died on that cross for us and did all those things for us. So kind of went through that probably a little bit quick, but to see, like I said, how Zedekiah, he never really listened to what Jeremiah told him, and that's kind of just was his downfall. And I know we all sit under preachers, and we sit under Pastor Tim, and we hear messages, and how we let them affect us, and what we do with them is going to be up to us. If it's a message for you and you don't act upon it, then that's going to be a detriment to yourself. If it's stepping all over your toes, and that's probably a good thing. That means God loves you, and he's trying to get your attention, and he's trying to get you back in the fold, and he's trying to make sure that you understand what's going on in your life, and he's not happy with it. And like I said, America, a lot of times we go down these roads. We're a selfish society. We're just so selfish in this country anymore. I mean, we see it, and y'all get tired of me talking about children at one point in time, I'm sure, but we see it even in the kids. We either want to abort them, or maybe if they're born, we just want to let her mom and daddy raise them. We'll let their grandparents raise them. We'll let just anybody raise them, because we want to go out and have our fun. We want to do our thing. And you think of that, and we see it in our church. We see it in other churches. You see folks that are trying to do the best they can for these children, and we think, man, that's terrible on that person, and it is. But what about the children? What about when those children get to an age where they realize, wow, my mom and daddy don't care a thing about me. I'm being raised by my grandma and grandpa because the other ones don't love me. It's always this thing, and the devil plants these seeds, and the devil jerks somebody out of a family, and he allows these things to happen. And we're fortunate here. We've got some good godly grandparents and some good godly family members that try to do right by these children. And we've got folks amongst this church that are trying to do right by some of these children. But at the same time, these kids have to live through that. You have these movements in the country, whether it's transgender, pride, whatever. Those things are evil. They're just pure evil. They go against everything that God created. And that's what these people were doing back here. It even tells us that one of these kings here, maybe Manasseh, he put his child to the fire. We learned last week, when you put the child to the fire, you're just sacrificing him to a god and killing him, right? They're taking these statues of the god, they're heating it up real hot till it turns red, arms outstretched, they lay the baby in it. He sits there and burns up while they beat their drums or they can't hear him screaming. We're not to that extreme in this country to where it's right out in the open, but hey, we are a very ungodly society. There are some people making some inroads. You see a lot of people now on the street corners. You see a lot of people out trying to minister to them at the abortion clinics. You see these folks going out into the parades and trying to talk to folks. There's people out there that have got a lot of guts, because I'm telling you, when you see some of the videos of these folks and the opposition that they are getting, just by standing on the corner away from them preaching Jesus, the evil is in their face. That's right. And I'm glad you said that, because I know they said in September there was 2.4 million Bibles sold in this country, and that was a 36%, I believe it was, increase over September of last year on whoever tracks these things and how they're getting their information. So there is, in a sense, I don't want to say a revival, but there's things happening. There's people getting out there. It's like Jimmy said, there's people getting out there speaking. There's people getting more interested, and the devil doesn't like it. So guess what? He's going to fight harder. You know, we brought up a few weeks ago about our arrows. Are we shooting all of our arrows? Because you can bet, and I didn't think to say it then, that the devil is using every one of his tools against us. The devil is using all his tools. He is going against us with everything that he has. He's going to come at you from all sides, no matter what it may be. He's going to try to just turn you in circles and try to, and get you just discombobulated, if you will, and not know your bearing. But we know if we rely on Jesus, if we do what he has us to do, those things will be fine. Lots of things I'll get home today and say, man, why didn't I say this? Why didn't I say that? I've got about 8 pages of notes here, and I didn't read one of them. But at the same time, sometimes you write it down, you get it in your mind, and it gets all crazy, right? But let's listen to God. Let's don't be like Zedekiah. Let's be like Matthew 13:9 says. Those who have ears, let us hear. And let us be discerning on what we're hearing. Let's not put faith in people just because they say something about Jesus. We're not to judge. But like Jack Shipley says a lot of times in our Bible studies, but we are fruit inspectors. We know a rotten apple from a good apple. We see actions. You can discern a person's character by the way they act. I had somebody talking to me this week, and we're talking about folks who claim to be a Christian, but yet they use language. They claim to be a Christian, but maybe they'll have a drink. I think we all know in our hearts where we should be, and that's not where we should be. We just pray for these folks that they see the trueness of God and what he would have them to do. Because that right there, when your testimony is that,